Okay, okay. Wow.
Good afternoon, and we are very happy to have you join us for the discussions in the epistle from Paul to the Corinthians, the first epistle. Last week we were discussing parts of chapter 7. We have been in chapter 7 now for a few weeks. We'll continue to cover the material found in that epistle, beginning this week with verse 16. But before beginning with verse 16, I want to back up just a little bit into the verses that precede it, primarily because verse 16 actually ties into those earlier verses. Now, of course, going back to the very beginning, Paul is responding, obviously, to an inquiry from the brethren in Corinth when he says in verse 1, considering the things whereof he wrote unto me. This, of course, with regard to marriage. And he says there to avoid fornication, let each man have his own wife and every woman her own husband. He talks about the responsibility to intimacy that we have, that the husband render unto the wife due benevolence. And of course, there in verse 5, to defraud you not one another, except it be for with consent for a time, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. So here again, Paul is speaking with them on issues and matters that are of concern to the Corinthians, somewhat misinterpreted by them, or perhaps they have decided to fasten an interpretation onto what Paul had written earlier. Paul says, of course, in verse 7, he wishes that everyone was as himself, but every man hath the proper gift. And so he says, if you're going to be, if your desire is to be married, marry, and then if it is not to be married, then it's not a sin not to be married. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. He says, however, if you cannot contain, if there is that urge, then rather than sin, he says, if they cannot contain, let them marry. It is better to marry than to burn. The verses that follow, of course, as we were discussing last week, having to do with whether one would depart unto the married I command, yet not I but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband, but if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to the husband, and let the husband not put away his wife. Unto the rest speak I, not the Lord. If a brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. Part of this discussion, of course, was whether or not a person who was a member of the church could marry a person who was not a member of the church. And obviously, this is a situation that they have in Corinth, where a person is a believer married to an unbeliever. There are different ways in which that could, of course, occur. A person, maybe a husband and wife, or in a Bible study, and the wife determines that she is going to obey the gospel, and the husband does not. There would be a case, of course, where you would have one married to an unbeliever. Perhaps there is also a case where a person is already a Christian. Let's say that a woman is already a Christian, and she is looking to marry someone, and the person that she marries is not a Christian. Both of those would be acceptable here. Some people, of course, and perhaps even in the Brotherhood today, feel that that is a sin, but they can't find the basis for that in the verses in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Here, of course, Paul goes on to discuss this relationship, and if there become problems in that relationship, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother have a wife that believeth not, she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. Verse 14, if the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband, else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. I think that phrase there gives enough of an explanation to the sanctity of that particular relationship for those who try to determine it otherwise. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, for God hath called us to peace. This leads us into verse 16, where it says, for what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband, or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? Two different schools of thought on this verse, and to some degree there is a bit of ambiguity. Some, of course, would view this verse from the standpoint of one remaining in the marriage, remain in that situation because there's a possibility. It's usually described as the optimistic or negative view. One might say, well, who knows whether you can save your husband or your wife? Stay in that situation regardless, because you might be able to save them. Another view, of course, and grammatically one can interpret it perhaps either of these two ways. You have to look at the larger context, and that's what we want to look at today as we go back also to some of the earlier discussion. But the other one is, how do you know that you can do this? How do you know that by staying in this marriage, how do you know that by staying in this relationship that you're going to be able to do this, or the unlikelihood of this? Let's open it up a little bit for discussion, move back also a little bit in what we were talking about last week, and then come up to what I'll view as a general discussion on the influence that we should be able to have on others. First of all, Mike, have you heard these two views on verse 16?
Not particularly. Most of the discussion that I've heard is based on verse 15, but verse 16 very simply says, you can save the one who's not a Christian.
Okay.
And thus there's that possibility. The for there, for what knowest thou, would look back on, here's a conclusion that he's making from what he has said previously, which would go back specifically into those verses that you're not to leave.
Hold on for a second. So with verse 15 in mind, had you not heard the other interpretation of it as rather a negative? Why do you, in other words, why do you think that you'll be able to save your husband, or why do you think you'll be able to save your wife?
I have not heard that aspect. And looking at it, it doesn't appear that way to me in reading it. And what I would say is that you have the possibility. He's saying, here's a conclusion for, and it's the Greek word gar, which is a conclusion. Sometimes we might say because you can save your wife, or you can save your husband, you can save that non-believer. I think that ties in with what Peter is discussing in 1 Peter 3, and how that the wife submits to her husband even though he's not a Christian. And without a word being spoken, she, by her influence, is able to save her husband.
Well, let me go back. Let me go back to verse 15. If the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how? I'm going to paraphrase it. For how do you know that you can save your husband? Or how do you know that you can save your wife? Rather, the idea of, would you remain in that relationship with the fact being that this may never turn into a situation where you can save them. I'm just using that in some of the studies. I was looking at a number of lexicographers in their discussions on it, and it seemed that there is some disagreement, or I don't want to use that term disagreement, make it sound too strong, because none of them really pushed it in an agenda. But there was the possibility that it's also saying that one, how do you know, posing it more as a negative than looking at it from the more optimistic view. I've always tended to view it more optimistically, the possibility that a person could turn things around with regard to the husband or with regard to the spouse, that one could, by the gospel, whether as an example or how in various different ways it's been described, bring that person to Christ. But you had not heard that
I had
alternate.
not really heard that presented. I don't see that really, from my standpoint, I don't really see that so much in the text.
Okay.
Maybe I'm missing something as far as uh, the grammar or something, but
Okay. Sonny, have you ever come across an interpretation along those lines in this set of verses?
No, not for myself personally. I'm more inclined to take the view that I think that verse 16 is the conclusion for Paul's instructions in verse 38. Like as he said that that in the event where the unbelieving spouse were to depart, that this brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. So and then he follows from therefore, how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? I think it seems to suggest that to someone who's a Christian contemplating on following the unbelieving spouse, think perhaps harboring the optimistic thought that, well, if he depart, I'll follow him. I'll be like his slave. Perhaps I could save him. I think that Paul is basically saying that you think that by being his slave and following him and giving up your faith, you will save him.
Well, that's the compromise that's being.
That's right.
Mhm.
Yes, I think that, but I take that view that I think that Paul was basically saying to the brother or sister who was thinking of giving up their faith in the sense stop attending church, for example, in modern terms, and in order to keep the marriage alive, thinking that by so doing that they could save the unbelieving one. So I think that Paul was posing the question by saying that, well, it's not going to happen, if you do that.
Well, and to that idea, Paul says, to the Jew I became a Jew, and so forth, and the idea that some of, not that I've ever heard anyone actually try to press this point, but if you're going to influence a person who's in a bar, then you need to be in the bar with them. If you're going to influence a person in away from sin, then somehow you need to really be with them. And of course, you can't condone any sinful activities or anything like that. But that idea of to what extent will one go in order to try to save that person. Some of the commentators and some of the linguists that I was looking at on this have shown their arguments on both sides of that. How do you know that? How do you know that by compromising in this particular way, going back, of course, to verse 15, that you're really going to save this person? And the optimist view, of course, is, look, there's a real possibility. Don't give up on a person. There's a real possibility. What knowest thou, whether thou wilt save thy husband, or how knowest thou? In other words, there's the positive possibility that you may be able to influence that person. I'm going to come back to that in a broader view in a moment. But I would like to go back to the discussion just briefly before we move on into that area with regard to the idea of the discussion we had to the unmarried and widows good to abide as I am. If she depart, let her remain unmarried to be reconciled to her husband. Let not the husband put away the wife. Verse 12. Now here in the discussion, and I wrote Michael during the week a little bit about this, the idea that, Michael, do you have that? I don't have it right in front of me, but part of the note that I put up in terms of what my view of that had been, I think I had mentioned something about the idea that here she was separating from her, she was not with her husband, but the possibility of her being away from him and waiting
A separation as legal action.
not so much a legal action. I don't think it, as you pointed out, I don't think that there was a legal action, but that she had simply was no longer with him. I don't think, as you mentioned, I don't think that there was something there that was clearly defined as a legal separation, but she just no longer was living with him. We had talked about this just briefly, the fact that there are two different words used there, maybe in a gender-specific way, perhaps. The word depart, different from, of course, the put away or divorce in the second portion of that, husband put away or divorce his wife. Maybe Paul is using that. The wife can't, not legally being able to divorce her husband, perhaps, but she can leave him, but let her remain unmarried. Of course, if she receives a paper of divorce, then of course she still has no cause to remarry. Paul here recommended that she be reconciled to her husband. I think that in the interpretation that you were presenting last week, the idea of her departure represented a divorce. Is that correct?
It was in Roman law. A separation, if you separated, you were divorced. That was the way in which they divorced. To a great extent, there was no, per se, legal action except from the separation of property. So if you left, you were divorced from a legal standpoint. And so, you know, that's the type of a arrangement that Paul was writing to these Corinthians. If you leave, that is a legal divorce as far as that time is concerned. And that's why the terms you use various, or Paul, the scriptures would use various terms, but when those terms are applied to the marriage relationship,
within that context,
in the context of marriage relationship, it always dealt with divorce, even though it's different terms. And that's because you could use a formal word for divorce in the sense of put away, or to send away, or to leave, to separate. Any of those terms within the context of marriage are all divorce, as we would think of it. And so as we would think today of a legal separation or just two people separating, that wasn't really known. If they separated, they were divorced.
But then, you know that...
And the other person didn't even have to know about it. There's cases that are seen from a historical standpoint that shows that here's an individual who leaves his wife and it being divorced, and she never knows about it until way after, and he's already married to someone else. And when he dies, then there's the property dispute, and as a result of the property dispute, it actually goes to the court or to the law. And by his action of leaving her, he divorced her.
Without a paper of divorcement?
There is no paper of divorcement at that time.
Okay.
It did not exist. Just if he left or she left with that intention, then they were divorced.
Sonny, you were saying something?
Yes, the one thing that puzzles me is this: if the word in verse 11, depart, implies a divorce, that it doesn't make sense, because at the end of verse 11, the Paul said, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. So when you put them together, You know what? Basically, that to paraphrase is that okay, if she wants to leave you, then just they stay unmarried and all be reconciled. But you husbands should not divorce her. You know, simply for the fact because that she has left you. You know, like
Well,
today, isn't it?
well,
That
well.
okay.
Here's Sonny, though. I think as we
Mm,
see going all the way through this chapter, they're not two. He in every instance he addresses both of them. Uh,
mm,
he mentions the husband. Let not, for instance, if you go with verse 14, let not the unbelieving for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. I think
mm,
he's giving the example to both of them. He could have
yeah.
just been speaking to them together, let the husband and the wife, but he seems here to be using both of them with the same point in mind, rather than two different points.
Uh, the case would be in verse 11, he addresses first the wife. She's
Mm,
not to leave if because that would be divorce. She would have divorced him by such from a legal standpoint, but of course from God's standpoint, uh, they're not divorced, and thus let her remain unmarried, because if she married someone else in that situation and it's not for fornication, she's committing adultery. Um, but she can be reconciled to her husband because they are, from God's standpoint, still married.
And
And
I,
he addresses the husband. Husband's not to send away or put away his wife, and that again, divorce. So he's dealing with it first from the standpoint of the wife and her actions. Then he's dealing with it from the husband and his actions.
mm,
And I think, Michael, we see this beginning in verse 2. Let every man have his own wife, let every woman have her own husband, let the husband render to the wife due benevolence, likewise the wife unto the husband. The wife hath no power of her own body, but the husband, likewise the husband hath no power of his body, but the wife. I think he moves this step, and even though he speaks to each one of them, he's really speaking to both of them about the same thing. So I think that's what we're seeing. I don't think there's really a difference that he's making here. I think he's showing that the responsibility that we have, one to the other, is the same. Even as the husband is the head of the wife in these situations, they are both responsible to God in the same way.
Even though he uses two different words in verse 11 in relationship to the wife, chorizo, and in relationship to the husband, aphemi, they're dealing with the same idea as far as divorce is concerned. If a husband sent away or put away his wife, he has divorced her. If a woman, chorizo, departed from her husband, then they were divorced. So both of them, within the context of marriage, both of those words have application to divorce.
I think also at verse 11, and just the more I looked at this, I began to think about it a little bit more along the line of a divorce from the standpoint, if she depart, let her remain unmarried. The implication there, of course, is that if she departed, that would signify a divorce, and with the idea toward a remarriage, Paul here is saying, no, if she departs, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. I think, though we don't have the same exact wording toward the latter part of that phrase in verse 11, that the implication is pretty much the same.
The departing would be the divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And just like from the husband's standpoint, his putting her away is the act of divorce as far as a legal standpoint at that time. They didn't have to go to the courts. It wasn't regulated in that way. And so the very act of her leaving or departing there was the divorce. And you see the divorce from the standpoint of let her remain unmarried. Well, she was still married from God's standpoint. That's why you'd be reconciled to her husband.
Well, let's go back up to verse 10. Unto the married, which of course here he's speaking to both, yet not I but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. I mean, we have to couple verse 11 to verse 10. We can't take it solely on its own, but also and unto the married, that means the husband and wife, let the wife not depart from her husband, but if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled.
You have in verse 10 with that statement, let not the wife depart from her husband, and the latter part of verse 11, let not the husband put away his wife. You have essentially the same thing taking place.
Right.
And it just simply uses a synonym for divorce. Where
well,
it reads,
the implication is also there for in terms of remarriage in verse 11.
Let them remain unmarried or be reconciled. And that would be just as applicable to the husband as it would be to the wife.
So in such a case, one thing that puzzles me is that, if by her departing under Roman law that she was deemed to have divorced her husband,
mm-hmm.
How would she reconcile to her husband if they decided to patch up from the legal point of view? I wonder that did they need to marry each other again by law?
Well, let me right here though, if I understand it correctly, even though under Roman law she might be unmarried or divorced, still in the eyes of God, she's not divorced because she is not. There's not been the exception from Matthew 5 verse 19. She is not doing so because of adultery.
Okay, but then from what I'm trying to say is basically that if by Roman law that when I'm just thinking aloud here basically. If under Roman law, which was most likely the case, when she leaves the house, that she would be deemed by the law to have divorced herself from her husband. So that and hence the use of the term depart as to represent divorce there. So Paul said that, or be reconciled to her husband. So if she departed from her husband and hence by law having been divorced from her husband, so maybe let's say a year down the line she changed her mind, she wanted to be reconciled to the husband. So did that mean that they would have to undergo another marriage in a sense by law in order to be legally living as husband and wife? You see what I mean?
That's a good question. I don't. I would have to go back and look and study that question. I'm not sure on the technicalities of the Roman law regarding that. Michael, do you have some insight into that?
One thing that's puzzling there. Yeah, because we can't simply.
I understand what you're asking, Sonny. I just don't have a good answer right now for it as to under Roman law.
I understand because the reason why I'm asking is because that I think it's like the case a few weeks ago. If you remember that we were discussing that this brother and sister who got married in a sense in a church wedding in the U.S. You remember that not registering their marriage. So that was the sort of argument that he used. As far as we're concerned, in the eyes of God, we are married. Who cares about the law says? You see? So I think it's important for the church to present something that the perception that the church follows the law in that sense as well as follow God. So if this Christian sister left her husband and was divorced according to Paul's letter here by Roman law, so if she decides to reconcile with her husband, although in the eyes of God that they have never been divorced, they have been married all the time. But in the eyes of the world, she can't simply just go back and live with him without fulfilling what the legal requirements were, isn't it? Or else the church would be accused of condoning adultery.
Well, I'm going to go back and take a look at that with regard to Roman law itself. But of course, here, and these are hypothetical.
Our day, though, because we would have the same situation. A couple marries, they decide to get a legal divorce. They're still married as far as God is concerned.
Yes.
From the legal standpoint, they're divorced. What do they do now if they come back together?
Yes.
They obviously can and have that right. And from our standpoint, yes, they should go through the legalities and make things from a legal standpoint to correspond with the spiritual standpoint in that situation.
Yes.
Though even though from the standpoint of the Lord, that would not, it would be a requirement, but at the same time not inherently, only because of the legal standpoint.
Only from the legal standpoint, right? From God's standpoint, they were married the entire time.
Yeah.
They've always been married.
They've always been married, and they're just, and using the term reconciled there, they're just simply reconciled. But from a legal standpoint, and because we should obey the laws of the land, they should go through those legalities in order to harmonize the two.
Otherwise, legally, the civil government would simply recognize them as we term over here, living together or shacking up.
Right.
That's right.
And that would be also providing things honest in the sight of all men.
In the sight of all men.
Which we should, try and make sure that we do.
Right. So the other thing I wanted to, as we move just off this phone, I don't want to turn my sound off right now, but verse 16.
I'm sorry, we're not available to take your call at this time. Please leave a message and we'll get back to you as soon as.
Thank you. Verse 16. This is one that often we find people struggling, not so much this verse in and of itself, but some of the ideas behind this verse, to what extent one should go in an attempt to convert one's spouse. And are there compromises that must be made, sacrifices that must be made, should be made? We have had many instances, let me see, many. We've had a number of instances in San Mateo where we've had husbands or wives whose spouses were not members of the church. Oftentimes they've come to us, what can we do? Can we have classes together? Is there something that I can do to help, to encourage? I think every congregation has come across these kinds of situations. One of the things that is, of course, at the very forefront of this is what kind of example the believing spouse is setting for the unbeliever. Are they faithful? Are they in regular attendance? Do they adhere to all of the teaching of the scriptures with regard to this? We have seen in some instances where you'd have an unbeliever and their spouse is a believer, but the spouse is not in regular attendance, or the spouse will go with the unbeliever to certain activities, or could even be movies that a Christian should not go to. These are the kinds of things that we're seeing that create quite a difficulty for people being married to unbelievers. Now, of course, every situation is different. In some instances, they fit right into what we were saying. Sometimes you have a couple and the wife will believe or the husband will believe through the study, and the other spouse will not. Sometimes you'll have a Christian that's getting ready to marry, and they'll marry a person that's not a Christian. These are two different things, really. So the expanse of a conversation would have to be narrowed down. What experiences? Maybe I'll open it up this way. What experiences have you all had with regard to some of these examples. Sonny?
In our congregation, we have a sister who is married to an unbeliever. In fact, I encouraged her to watch on YouTube last week's class. It was good on this point. She said to me that having gone through that experience herself, she struggled for years. She fell away for a while, and she was restored and came back. And now she's a lot much stronger in her faith now. And she said to me that last week that given an opportunity to advise younger people, she would advise them not to do it.
Not to marry an unbeliever?
That's right. Yes, she's married to an unbeliever, and so
No,
she has.
Would the person have been? They were a Christian first and then married an unbeliever?
That's right. Yes,
Okay.
yes,
Okay.
yes. She was a member of the church in Singapore, and then until she married an unbeliever, and she fell away for a while, and she's back now. So, and she said, well, I would not advise people to do that. And I've seen with my own eyes that brethren who married unbelievers, and subsequently fell from the faith. Chances of them converting the other half, I think, is much lesser. I think that there's a greater risk of falling away rather than turning the other party up around.
I'll get back to that point in a second. Michael?
I think obviously it's bad for a Christian married non-Christians. It's sinful, that's another matter. Wisdom, obviously, you should not. As to activities with a non-Christian, as long as it does not violate Christian principles, if you're married to that non-Christian, it becomes difficult sometimes, but as long as it does not violate Christian principles, violate your living for Christ and doing everything that God authorizes you to do, then you should engage in those activities. With those limitations, of course. And in those things, show and demonstrate the type of life that a Christian should live. And be that light in a world of darkness to try to convert the non-believer.
I think in the case of where you have a husband and wife, and then one becomes converted, there's probably, and I'm just guessing here, I don't have any hard facts behind me, I would guess that there's the possibility is greater of converting a spouse than if you are already a Christian and you marry a non-believer. I could be entirely wrong on my point here, but I think that if you marry a person who is a non-believer, the probability of their being converted is low. Obviously, it has happened before. We've known many cases, a number of cases where members who were formerly members in San Mateo had done so. In some cases, they were able to convert their spouse, and in other cases, not. Sometimes people call into question when the spouse does convert, whether it's out of a true, sincere heart or whether to appease the other spouse. Of course, that's a question I'm not going to try to answer. But you do have a difficulty when you are marrying someone who is a non-Christian because the priorities are going to really be different. And when you think of what the primary priority in life should be, which is to serve God, that's going to be the priority of the believer. That is not going to be priority of the unbeliever. And when you put that together with the raising of children, how should they be raised? Will they be raised in the church? Will they be able to stay home with the father? You're going to have a level of anxiety that you would much rather be without. And I have called into question, as Michael said, it's certainly not a sin. 1 Corinthians 7 shows that. But you almost have to call into question a person's judgment as to why they would make that decision. It is almost as if they are not entirely, but almost as if they're putting that person before the Lord. There are the inherent responsibilities that a spouse has to the other, and I think that one is just making their life a little bit more difficult and complicated than necessary. A person may say, well, there are no Christian men or women in my congregation. There are no faithful congregations around. This is a person that I've come to fall in love with. They love me. They're just not interested in God. They're not going to inhibit or prohibit my worship and service of God. So what's wrong with that? That might be a little bit rosier statement made than becomes actuality, because there will always be things that come up in the lives of people who are unbelievers, whether it's their side of the family or something that you want to do together, where you will find yourself having those conflicts. Do you counsel a person not to marry, or do you simply make them aware of the pitfalls? Michael?
I missed about half of that because some lightning hit and we lost some power over here for a second. But
my question is, would you counsel a person? Of course, we have to counsel people who are members of the church who are interested in being married. Would you actually counsel them against getting married, or would we simply say that our responsibility is to make them aware of the pitfalls?
I would counsel them against that type of a marriage.
Would you refuse to perform a wedding?
No, I would not.
Okay.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
But I would advise the Christian not to, from the standpoint of the problems that you're going to face. If you want to put Christ first within your life, how can you put Christ first if you're marrying someone who is not putting Christ first? There's an old statement that I heard a long time ago in relationship to those type of marriages, that at some point in time you're going to have trouble with your father-in-law. Took you a second, Johnny.
It did.
But if you think about it, that is the truth of the situation.
Yes.
Their father-in-law, of course, being, just to make the point, is Satan. John 8:44. You're going to have trouble with your father-in-law at some point in time, because the very thrust of your life is different than the non-believer. So I would counsel against it in every way that I could. And of course, generally the statement is, well, I'll convert him I'll convert her after we're married. We'll do it before you're married. Let's see how it works. So that's that. But would I refuse to marry them or perform the ceremony? Not necessarily. From the standpoint of, I recognize that by doing the ceremony, I might have influence over him or the non-believer and the family of the non-believer. Whereas refusing to, I might not.
You might lose both of them.
Right. So it's a matter of judgment in that type of situation.
Yeah, we've had situations where we had a young married couple, and one was not a Christian, and we engaged in many studies with that person. They are still not Christians. They're no longer in the area. But of course, the commitment to the Lord is weakened when you're only half a couple. And I think that's something that people, often younger people, really don't seem to see. They're seemingly idealistic about this possibility. Whereas you said before, convert them before you marry. And then you know that your life will be much better. So it's one of the things that we face. I thought looking at verse 16 that that's certainly something to be aware of when you think of here's a situation where a person, how do you know you're going to be able to save that person? What is the guarantee of that? Or also looking at it in the optimistic way, the possibility that you can influence, the possibility that you can bring that person to Christ, and certainly you would like to be able to do that. Do that before. The advice to the young person who is considering marriage, you're in fellowship with God. You want the person next to you to be in fellowship with God as well. Certainly that would be the way to proceed through this life. A person may say, well, that doesn't always turn out as perfectly as one would hope, and of course that can be true. But it makes it a little easier. Now, there are instances and cases where even in a marriage where you have both Christians, that many things can enter in to create disharmony and discord. One person can begin to move away from the Lord, and that can cause great difficulties and pain. But if you marry a Christian and you're trying to bring your children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, from the very onset, that should make the path a little easier. Any closing thoughts, Sonny?
Well, my view is basically that if I'm going to advise a person, I would advise against marrying a non-Christian, as well as a Christian who is not faithful.
Well,
I
what's
think
the
that yeah,
I mean, there's very
that's
little
right, yes.
difference.
Yes, that's right. And you know that for people who are thinking of doing so, I would have that on the day of the wedding, you'll be wearing more than the wedding ring. You'll be wearing suffering, torturing, persevering as well. They're asking for trouble.
Okay. Let's go ahead and come to a close for our discussion today. Next week we will pick up and begin with verse 17. Of course, there's a lot that is being discussed in verses 17 and following. So it looks like before we get to the end of this chapter, we will have at least 2 discussions between now and then. I think we'll probably have to break them up. I don't think it's possible that we can get all of this information in one study, and we don't really have to. So next week we'll begin with verse 17. We'll go as far as we can. We hope that you'll be able to join us. We look forward to it. We hope that you can, of course, recommend someone to view it online, or of course on YouTube. I believe it's at Michael Hatcher 52. We are so thankful for you being with us this afternoon, and for those who are in the UK this evening, we'd like to say goodbye, and we hope to see you next week.